Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. The morning at Fort Ridgefield came in clean and bright. Air moved across the parade field with that cool bite you only get before the sun climbs high. The flag on the main pole snapped, steady and sure. Trucks idled near the motor pool, radios clicked on and off, and the cadence of boots started to build into a rhythm that carried across the base. Grace Callahan took a seat halfway up the bleachers and wrapped both hands around a paper cup of coffee she barely wanted. She was early on purpose. She liked to watch the field wake up, to see the rows settle into lines, to catch Nathan before the day chewed him up. Out on the asphalt, Captain Nathan Callahan stood squared to his unit. Uniform pressed, sleeves set just right, dog tags tucked. He said little this early. He never had to. The way he stood spoke for him. Section leaders moved down the ranks, fixing spacing with 2 fingers and a nod. Weapons were checked and rechecked. The simple stuff mattered more than people thought, Nathan always said. Do the small things right, the big things follow. Grace could hear him in her head, same tone as the first year they met, same calm that talked her through storms she didn't show anyone else. Beyond the field, the low block buildings of Ridgefield Tactical Headquarters sat with their doors open, staff already moving. Colonel Richard Vaughn cut a path from HQ toward the reviewing line, cap tucked under his arm, eyes doing quick math on everything he passed. He didn't waste steps. He didn't waste words. People straightened when he was near because they knew he noticed. Near the medical cart, Major Caroline Foster stacked kits and clipped a checklist to a board. Gloves in the right size, airway kit sealed, saline bags full, monitors charged. She never assumed quiet meant safe. She preferred proof. Her team moved without noise, the kind of coordination you only get from repetition. On the far corner, a cluster of new recruits waited for instruction. Private Logan Harris stood with his helmet tilted back a touch too far and his jaw set hard. He kept glancing toward Nathan's company like a kid watching a varsity huddle. Grace recognized the look. Everyone wants to learn the right way, she thought. Most don't admit they're scared of getting it wrong. She pulled her jacket a little tighter. Virginia mornings could fake you out. Sun said warm, shade said not yet. From the bleachers she could see the whole grid, the painted lane markers, the stack of training cones, the barricade near the gate, the chalked box for weapons drill. The base looked organized because it had to be. Nothing was by accident. That was the point. Grace had driven in from Ashwood Valley the day before to give Nathan a clean morning. No laundry talk. No bill reminders. No honey-do list whispered at the door. She wanted him sharp and clear. Being here today was rare. Schedules didn't often line up. When they did, she took the seat, sipped a coffee she didn't need, and watched the man she loved do the thing he was built to do. Nathan turned his head slightly, eyes tracking the length of his soldiers. Sun caught the edge of his cheek and the metal at his collar. He lifted one hand, palm down, and the row leaders mirrored it. Everything tightened by half an inch. He said one word Grace couldn't hear from the stands, and the formation shifted to open ranks with a clean, practiced slide. Stocks rose. Muzzles centered. Feet locked. The sound of it rolled like a single click. Vaughn stopped at the sideline and watched. He didn't give away approval with a smile, but he didn't have to. If he stayed, it meant the standard was worth his time. Caroline's cart angled closer to the shade, always within range but never in the way. Logan's class broke out to jog the perimeter, and he looked over his shoulder twice before his drill sergeant snapped him forward. Grace breathed in steady. She wasn't military, but she understood tempo. A base had a pulse. Some days it ran hot. Some days it kept even. Today felt even. That was good. Even meant routine. Routine meant everyone drove back through the gate at night. Nathan stepped into the center box for weapons handling. Rounds were blanks for drill, but habits didn't bend. His hands moved in short, exact motions. Lift, clear, present, hold. The line followed him. Grace could tell when his mind slipped into that narrow lane where the world went quiet. He was hard to reach there. He was also safest there. A breeze rolled off the tree line and pushed the scent of cut grass across the asphalt. Somewhere near the motor pool, a wrench clinked on concrete. A radio cracked, then settled. Vaughn spoke to an aide and pointed toward the gate, likely about traffic flow for a delivery window nobody wanted to miss. Caroline checked her watch. Grace checked the time on her phone without meaning to. Nathan set the pace, and the unit kept up. Minutes turned into a smooth block you didn't want to break. Grace let her shoulders loosen and leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. She studied faces the way she always did, memorizing the small markers of focus and fatigue. She didn't kid herself about what this job could cost. That was why she showed up when she could, why she waved at the gate guards by name, why she said thank you to the clerk who handed her a visitor badge like it weighed something. Logan's group rounded the corner again, breath loud, steps ragged, determination bigger than form. He glanced toward the formation a third time and then caught himself, pushing through the turn with a little more drive. He would learn, Grace thought. Most do, if they have the right people in front of them. The sun climbed a little higher. The flag snapped again. Nathan called the next sequence, and rifles moved as one. A camera on a tripod clicked off a test shot near the bleachers. Grace didn't look away from the field. She kept her eyes on Nathan, on the cadence, on the clean lines that said everything was under control. She liked days that started this way. Clear. Predictable. No surprises leaning on the fence line. Caroline's radio buzzed in her pocket, just a small alert from the clinic, nothing urgent by the look on her face. Vaughn checked his watch and shifted his stance. A pair of Humvees rolled slow along the rim road like they always did at this hour, nothing to make anyone stare. The gate arm lifted and dropped in an easy cycle. The base, for the moment, sat inside its routine, exactly where everyone wanted it. Grace took another sip of coffee, finally warm enough to taste. She exhaled, set the cup beside her, and fixed her eyes on the field as Nathan brought his unit to the next mark. In her chest, the pace of the morning matched her own heartbeat, steady, measured, ready. She didn't know it yet, but this quiet, this order, this feeling that everything was exactly where it belonged, was the last simple moment before the day changed. For now, it was just a clean morning at Fort Ridgefield, and she was here to see it when the first crack in the morning showed itself. Nathan pivoted for the next call, set his foot, and a hitch ran through his posture like a skipped beat. His rifle knocked the edge of his boot, slipped from his hands, and hit the asphalt with a hard metallic clatter that made every head shift a fraction. The rhythm of the line faltered. One step went late. Another hand tightened too fast. It wasn't loud to the whole base, but to Grace it was a lightning bolt. Nathan didn't recover the drop. He swayed, knees unsteady, breath not catching the way it should, and went forward onto his palms, then his chest. The formation froze as if someone cut the audio. In the same breath, Caroline was already moving, her cart rolling, a medic pacing her, gloves snapped on mid-stride. Grace stood without realizing it. The cup tipped and tapped the bleacher plank, coffee sliding in a dark crescent she didn't see. Her eyes went to Nathan, then to the rifle lying a few yards short of the chalk box, angled across the lane marker. Vaughn lifted a hand to halt the next company at the edge of the field and cut his gaze to the gate. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. People listened to how he moved. Caroline reached Nathan, voice low and fast to her tech, monitor leads out, airway check, pulse count, pupils. Nathan's chest rose, not strong, not gone. Grace felt the air thin around her face. Move, she told herself, and her legs listened. She came down the bleacher steps, careful and quick, the way you move past strangers who are about to turn into family whether they want to or not. The field held its breath, and that stillness made the next sound land like a punch. From beyond the barricade near the main gate, a Humvee revved harder than routine and came in at an angle that didn't match the lane. The gate arm lifted on schedule, but the vehicle didn't slow for the checkpoint window. It took the inside edge, tires scraping the paint and throwing chalk dust. A guard moved to signal stop, hand up, but the driver didn't give him a glance. The nose of the truck dipped and surged, engine grinding up into the red. Vaughn's right hand snapped to his radio, and the nearest sergeant spun to redirect bodies off the path. The recruits along the rim road broke stride and scattered toward the inner fence. Logan hesitated a half step, instincts torn between staying with his class and trying to help the line that hadn't fully reacted yet. The fear on his face was clean and new, the kind you only wear once. Grace's world sharpened to 3 points, Nathan on the ground, Caroline at his shoulder, and the rifle in the lane. She was a visitor with a paper badge that said don't touch what isn't yours. She knew there were rules for a reason. She also knew what a moving engine meant when it didn't belong where it was. The truck wasn't drifting. It was feeding power. It was heading for the barricade that protected the heart of the field, exactly where people were kneeling, exactly where her husband lay. She stepped onto the asphalt. The heat of the surface pushed through her soles. The hum of the engine carried into her ribs. A young specialist started toward her with both palms out, the kind of unsure stop sign you give someone who has already made up their mind. He looked past her at the vehicle and stopped himself. Grace didn't run. She didn't sprint. She moved the distance she needed in a straight line and crouched over the rifle, hands steady because they had to be. Fingers curled, stock set into her shoulder, cheek down, eyes on the sight. Breath in. Not deep. Controlled. Memory unrolled like a simple checklist she didn't ask for. She knew how to align irons. She knew how to keep both eyes open when the background was moving. She knew the difference between noise and threat. The driver's face was a blur through the glass, posture forward, left hand high on the wheel, right hand low like he'd braced for impact more than once in his life. No waver. No flinch. No interest in the shouted commands at the edge. Caroline's voice cut through behind Grace, calm and clipped, calling out a heart rate and a request for a saline bag. It anchored Grace where she was. Nathan was breathing. He needed time. Time wasn't on offer if that truck reached the barricade at speed. Vaughn shifted 2 steps left to give anyone with a shot a clean lane. No one had it yet. Lines were wrong. Angles were bad. Seconds were thin. Logan's boots slapped the pavement as he pulled a private out of the truck's projected path. He turned and saw Grace with the rifle, eyes wide, recognition landing that this wasn't a mistake or panic. It was a choice. He didn't know her. He didn't have to. He pivoted and dragged a cone marker aside so nothing tripped her stance. The Humvee crossed the inside hash. The gate guard backpedaled to the wall. The engine filled the field space and pressed into everyone's chest. Grace set her front sight where the motion became a line she could predict. She kept her finger indexed, not on the trigger, not yet. Distance collapsed faster than the noise in her ears. A warning shot would waste the single window she had. A bad shot would turn steel and glass into shrapnel. A late shot would be no shot at all. She pictured the follow-through, not the bang. Sight, press, hold, reacquire. Don't yank. Don't chase. Let the rifle do what it's built to do. She didn't ask permission from a world that didn't have time to answer. Her mouth was dry. Her hands were not. Somewhere behind, a camera clicked without understanding what it was about to catch. Somewhere ahead, a driver chose speed over sense. Grace set her feet, exhaled to the bottom of her breath, and began to take up the slack. The barrel tracked the glass where momentum and angle would meet. She didn't hear the words around her anymore. She only felt the field lean toward the same single point she did. The morning had started even. It wasn't even now. It was about to split open when the Humvee kicked sideways over the inner hash and the front bumper dipped hard enough to bite the curb and launch chalk dust into the air. The engine roared past routine and into that flat, ugly note mechanical things make when somebody forces them to do what they shouldn't. The gate guard flattened to the wall. A stack of orange cones toppled. The barricade shuddered in its hinges. Grace held her cheek to the stock and kept the sight line steady, the world narrowing to a rectangle of glass and a driver who refused every signal that said stop. Vaughn moved like a metronome set faster than the field could handle, clearing lanes with 2 fingers and sharp pivots. He didn't bark. His body did the talking. A forklift near the motor bay froze. 2 NCOs dragged a set of training shields out of the impact lane and threw them against the tarmac, buying 3 feet of space that might matter. The recruits scattered to the inner fence with the clumsy speed of people who'd never done it for real until right now. Logan grabbed a kid by the shoulder strap and yanked him clear of a stutter step that would have put him under the tire path. Caroline braced on one knee beside Nathan. Monitor leads sat where they needed to be. The readout bounced in a way that said present and fragile. She set a hand to his sternum, counted with her eyes, then looked up just long enough to spot the vector of the truck and judge distances she'd rather never have to measure. She told her tech to ready a bag and a line. Grace didn't hear the words, but she felt the steadiness of them. It put a boundary around panic. The rifle's weight settled into Grace's shoulder the way a good tool should. Her hands did what they knew. Index on the frame. Front sight where motion turned into a path she could predict. She ignored the instinct to rush. Rushing is how people miss. The glass danced with reflected sky and fence and a smear of sun. The driver leaned into the wheel, chin forward, the set of his neck wrong for anyone planning to brake. She tried to read intent in his posture and didn't like the answer. The Humvee bounced off the curb and corrected, now angling for the gap between the barricade and the bleachers. That lane wasn't meant to be open. Today it was. A maintenance cart sat half-turned there with a rake poking out the back. A corporal sprinted for it, then froze when he saw Grace's muzzle line and dropped to a knee instead, leaving the cart where it was. Obstacles helped when they slowed mass. They killed when they tripped shooters. Grace adjusted a hair to keep the rake handle from cutting her sight picture. A siren spun up from somewhere near HQ, late only because the morning had been quiet seconds ago. The sound pressed against everything in the yard and stacked on top of the engine's grind. Grace pulled it all down to signal and noise. She let the noise pass. Signal said the truck had one goal, reach bodies before anyone with authority could stop it. She thought of Nathan on summer ranges back home, teaching her to shoot a tin can off a fence post without turning the fence into splinters. Don't chase it, Gracie. Let the sight settle. Press. Hold. That memory was a lifeline she didn't expect to need at a parade field. Vaughn slid into her peripheral and then out again, never in her lane. He'd seen the badge on her jacket and the set of her shoulders and decided, just for this heartbeat, that rank and labels could wait behind physics. He lifted his palm to slow a pair of MPs who were about to cross her muzzle, then cut them across the back end of the truck's arc with a point that said flank it, don't meet it. Logan ended up inside the shadow of the bleachers, chest heaving, eyes on Grace. He saw it the way it really was, not the way training slides draw it. There wasn't time for a careful perimeter or a perfect angle or a committee. There was a person with a tool and a threat closing fast. He swept his arm at the last two kids in the lane and shoved them into the gap under the railing. Their helmets knocked wood. They'd have bruises later. Bruises meant they'd be around to complain. The Humvee closed the distance with a hunger that made the air feel thinner. Gravel spit from the tires. The hood lifted on a bounce and slammed back down. Through the spidering glare of the windshield, Grace caught a sliver of the dash, duct tape across something that looked like a cracked panel, a coil of wire snaking into the footwell, a glint of metal that had no good reason to be where it was. It might have been nothing. It might have been everything. The worst possibilities lined up fast. You don't wait to find out up close. Grace set her feet a little wider and sank 3 millimeters lower into the stock. She exhaled until the shaking in her shoulders loosened. Her finger moved from frame to trigger, not a jump, just the clean decision to be there. She knew the rifle would push into her when it worked. She knew the glass would burst in a way that sent fragments somewhere. She placed the sight where the driver's forward lean would carry him and where the wheel angle would track next, not where it sat now. The lane was bad. The window was small. The consequence for wrong was heavy. Caroline called for a second set of hands, then pressed her palm to the side of Nathan's jaw and checked for the smallest shift in tone. He gave her one. It wasn't much. It was enough to plan for later. She angled her body between him and the probable fragment path without thinking about it, because that was her job when shots happened near patients. Grace didn't see it. She felt the permission in her own spine to let the medical piece be handled by someone who had it. The barricade loomed 5 car lengths ahead of the truck. The driver didn't touch the brake. He dipped his chin and braced like he meant to punch through. Metal snapped against its restraints as the gate arm whipped sideways under the truck's wake. A clipboard blew off a folding table and slapped the asphalt near Grace's knee. She didn't flinch. Flinching is how people lose sights. A camera somewhere clicked in a pointless burst. Someone on the far edge yelled in a voice that had too much pitch to carry meaning. Vaughn lifted his hand again, 2 fingers, and the lane stayed clean. Logan pressed himself flat and didn't let his eyes close. Caroline's tech slid the line home and taped it. The siren wove in and out of the engine like 2 arguments you couldn't mute. The Humvee crossed the last painted mark. Grace read the angle one more time and adjusted the width of her stance the way her father had shown her, with a .22 on a windy day, not dramatic, just enough to keep the wobble from owning the shot. She told herself a truth out loud in her head, because truths help when fear wants to fill the space. If I wait for perfect, I get nothing. If I go now, I give them a chance. She took the slack out of the trigger until it reached the wall. The world tunneled to glass and sight and a moving set of shoulders behind it. She locked her jaw so her teeth wouldn't click on the brake. She held the breath she had, not too much, not too little. She didn't pray for aim. Aim is work, not luck. She did the work. Pressure built the way it should, smooth and certain, every ounce a decision. The truck ate the last feet of open ground, and she rode the front sight onto a line that finally, cleanly, felt right, and the trigger broke the way a good one should, no surprise, no jerk, just a clean snap that sent the recoil into her shoulder and the round forward into glass. The windshield didn't just crack, it exploded outward in a white burst that caught sunlight and turned to drifting grit. The Humvee hiccuped, swerved left, tires howling, then snapped back hard to the right with a shudder that rattled the grille. The driver's head jerked, his shoulders slumped an inch, and instinct, not training, kept his foot down a half beat longer than sense. The truck ate the last yards with a hungry, wounded lurch and slammed its front end into the metal barricade with the kind of crunch you feel in your molars. Air changed shape around the impact. A pocket of silence collapsed and popped. Cones sailed. A clipboard skittered away. The flag on the pole stuttered and then reset to its own rhythm, oblivious to people's heart rates below it. Grace took the recoil, kept the sight steady, and held through the shot like she'd taught herself to do in 100 smaller moments. Don't look up to see if it worked. Finish the work. She did. Then she lifted her cheek from the stock and took in the shape of the field in a single scan. The Humvee sat nose deep into the barricade at an ugly angle, radiator hissing, smoke curling up from under the hood in lazy gray threads. Glass sparkled across the asphalt, tiny stars catching on boot tread and tire grooves. The gate arm hung crooked, Hardware bent into a question mark that would take someone an afternoon to fix. The driver slumped over the wheel and then twitched, a sign of stubborn, messy consciousness that wasn't done fighting. Vaughn moved first. Not a run. A purpose. He stepped into a new geometry the crash had drawn and pointed 3 directions at once, MPs to flank, a fire extinguisher by the hood, a corridor kept clear from the barricade to the medical corridor. People obeyed because his hands made sense. Caroline shifted her stance and put her body between Nathan and whatever came off that truck next, fragments, smoke, or panic, while keeping one palm steady on his shoulder, reading his pulse without needing to see the numbers. Grace exhaled. Her hand steadied and then went still. Every muscle she had wanted to shake and didn't. The bass drew a breath with her and then let out a collective sound that wasn't cheering or fear, more like the thud of a heartbeat everyone heard together. Logan's eyes were round and bright under the bleacher's shadow, sweat cutting a line through dust on his cheek. He pressed the heel of his hand to the chest of the last recruit and shoved the kid backward into safety, then pushed himself upright because the part of him that was still new wanted to see the thing that almost crushed his morning. The truck sputtered. A belt squealed. The hood coughed up another braid of smoke. 2 MPs slid in along the driver's side with that low, fast movement people learn when there's still unknowns, explosives, weapons, second person. One took the door, the other took the rear quarter and peered inside the back. The interior looked wrong from the bleachers, a chaos of gear that didn't belong to a training loop. Duct tape. A torn jump bag. A plastic bin with its lid half off. A coil of wire that led nowhere good. Grace got to her feet with the rifle balanced low and thumbed the safety. Muzzle down, eyes up, the posture of someone who knew stopping wasn't the same as finished. As she stepped, she thought of the fraction of a second she'd owned, the distance, the angle, the breath she'd held to the floor, the press she'd chosen. There would be time later to feel the weight of it. Now there was the truck, the driver, and the field. Vaughn's palm cut across the air and made a lane between Grace and the MPs. Not an invitation to come closer, permission to exist in that space as someone who had just kept the base's math from going bad. He kept his voice low, not for secrecy but for control. The siren near HQ wound down to a lower note as someone killed the volume, and that small act made the morning sound more human again. Caroline's tech taped the line on Nathan's arm and lifted the bag. Nathan's chest rose, thin but steady, and a wash of relief slid through the people close enough to see it. He was there. He needed care. Caroline spoke into her radio, and a stretcher team angled toward her on a vector that avoided glass and heat shimmer. The MPs yanked the driver's door. It stuck, flexed, and then gave with a metallic shriek. The man behind the wheel, dust-clotted beard, eyes feral with the kind of near panic that always reads as rage, wrenched his shoulder and fought the seat belt like it was a third set of hands. One MP locked the belt webbing with a knife, the other took a wrist and pinned it. The driver snapped his head up, blood bright on his temple where glass had kissed him. He thrashed. The MP rode it out with the patience of a person who had practiced against a sandbag that wanted to be a man. Grace saw the coil of wire again, now clearer through the torn windshield. It snaked down past the steering column into the footwell and then under the floor mat, a sloppy path with bad intentions. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Vaughn followed her eyes, then threw a flat hand outward to clear casual bodies away from the truck's immediate orbit. Distance widened in a clean ring. An EOD call would come. Until then, smart space was the only pressure relief anybody had. The barricade complained with a groan that said metal had bent past forgiveness. The fire extinguisher foamed at the edge of the hood and cooled a hot point near the radiator with a hiss that felt weirdly civilized after the violence of the hit. The field smelled like hot rubber, glycol, and dust. Grace tasted grit at the back of her tongue and realized she'd been breathing shallow for too long. She made herself pull one slow breath and let it go. Logan edged out from the bleachers and stopped when he hit the line Vaughn's hand had drawn. He didn't need to be told twice. He looked at Grace like a person looks at a lighthouse after wave 3. She didn't look back. Her eyes stayed on the whole board, not the pieces. People moved where they should. Nobody moved where they shouldn't. That was the difference between a save and a narrow escape that still ends badly. A camera lens glittered near the far rail, catching fragments of an image it didn't deserve to own. Grace ignored it. Caroline lifted 2 fingers to the stretcher team and guided them down beside Nathan, already shifting her weight to coordinate the lift without jostling lines. Her mouth counted to 3 without sound. On 3, they moved as one. The driver finally lost the fight he'd been having with consciousness and slumped sideways. The MPs worked him free, wrists cinched, and dragged him over the seat with the practiced care of people who know panic flips back on like a bad light. They set him on the asphalt on his side, not flat, because airway beats punishment. One MP's eyes flicked up to Vaughn for the next instruction. Vaughn gave it with 2 words and a point toward the holding corridor that ran like a spine behind the parade field. The MPs nodded and hauled the man away, boots brisk, heads on a swivel, wire and bins left for people with a different badge to interpret. Grace lowered the rifle until the stock cleared her shoulder completely. The weight vanished from her bones slower than the weapon left her hands. She understood that timing. The body lags the moment. The mind runs ahead. The heart moves on its own timetable and makes you pay attention whether you want to or not. In the space where the engine noise had lived, other sounds returned. A distant forklift beeped as it reversed. The flag rope tapped the pole in a light rhythm. Someone coughed hard and then apologized to nobody in particular. A medic near the bleachers laughed once, short and disbelieving, not for humor but for pressure release. A bottle rolled and clinked until a boot trapped it. Vaughn stepped into Grace's peripheral vision and held there, not crowding, not pontificating. He studied the angle of the impact, the scatter of glass, the clear lane where her muzzle had tracked. The calculation on his face wasn't about glory. It was inventory, what almost happened, what did, what still could if anybody got stupid now. He acknowledged her with the smallest nod because his hands were busy owning the rest of the board. The nod landed anyway. It meant, the shot was the right call. We keep moving. Caroline's team wheeled Nathan toward the field hospital unit, monitors bumping over a seam in the asphalt. Grace took 1 half step as if to follow, then checked herself because the route had to stay clean. She watched the stretcher transition from sun to shade and then into the cool mouth of the medical corridor. The shadow swallowed the cart, and a weight in her chest she hadn't named shifted just enough to let air sit right. EOD would be here. Investigators would map tread marks and measure the spread of glass. Somebody would count how many seconds lived between rifle drop and barricade hit. Those numbers would make their way into a report. Reports would be read by people who weren't here. They would learn from the math. The math wouldn't capture the texture of the moment, the heat on the asphalt, the grit on the teeth, the split-second choice that pulled a base back from a line it almost crossed. Grace finally let her shoulders sag an inch. The rifle hung at her side like a thing that belonged to the morning more than to her. She wasn't a soldier. She had no rank to pin the choice on. All she had was the outcome, sitting in front of her in crumpled metal and cooling smoke, and the knowledge that the worst version of the day didn't arrive. Behind her, an aide jogged up with a roll of caution tape, hands shaking just enough to make the plastic wobble as it spun. Vaughn took the end, tore a strip cleanly, and set a boundary that told the base where the danger stopped and the living could stand. The peak had passed, but the air still hummed with aftershock. Bodies settled into rolls. Radios found new channels. The field's pulse, kicked wild by the truck and the shot, began to slide toward a pace that people could live with again. Grace closed her eyes once, brief, as if to mark a page she'd have to read later. When she opened them, the morning was still there, changed, dented, but there, and the work of making sense of it was already moving, and the base bent itself toward order the way a trained body finds balance after a hard hit. EOD rolled in with calm faces and practiced hands, set a perimeter wider than anyone wanted, and began the slow ritual of looking under, inside, and around. The coil of wire that had made everyone's stomach drop turned out to be part of a slapdash rig, ugly, careless, more threat by intention than by craft. They cut it, bagged it, photographed angles and shadows, and spoke in short codes that turned fear into entries on a log. A tow truck idled 2 blocks away until the scene boss waved it forward. The Humvee bled heat into the morning like a campfire dying on wet ground. Grace stayed where Vaughn's tape told the living to stand. The rifle was out of her hands now, logged and tagged by an armorer whose voice never rose above neutral. He asked for a name, a date, a time, and wrote in tidy block letters that didn't care about adrenaline. Grace answered, steady enough. Her hands had stopped wanting to shake. Her legs still remembered the first step onto the asphalt. She let that memory sit without pushing it away. Caroline checked back across the line with a nod that cut straight through the noise. Nathan was inside the field hospital, monitored, hydrated, stable. No dramatics, no cliff edge. The look in Caroline's eyes, settled, measured, gave Grace permission to breathe all the way down for the first time since the rifle hit the lane marker. She folded her arms, not out of defense but to keep the new quiet from floating off. The siren was gone. The flag stitched the same sky it had at dawn. Vaughn worked the field like a foreman who knew every bolt in the yard. He took statements in the shade of a transport container, never letting a crowd form, never letting gossip become a second incident. He put Logan at a folding table with a water bottle and a simple instruction: write what you saw from your feet, not from anybody else's mouth. The kid bent over the page like it was his first test that mattered. Sweat dried in a pale ring under his collar. He kept erasing words that tried to turn big into bigger and left the facts standing on their own legs. MPs moved Travis Hale, the driver, into a holding corridor with an escort that read both wary and bored, the way professionals look when they've timed this dance before. Medical gave him enough attention to keep him alive and no ceremony. The rage that had made him big in the windshield had shrunk to a dull, static hum behind cuffs and protocol. He wasn't the center anymore. Process was. When the tow finally pulled the Humvee off the barricade, the metal let go with a sound like a door being convinced to open its last time. The barricade bent back a little under a pry bar and a set of shoulders, not perfect, passable. Someone would replace it before evening, because that's how bases heal, one exact, ordinary repair at a time. Grace watched glass sweep into neat lines, a strange comfort in the way small brooms can tidy a place where big danger just stood. She let herself go see Nathan. The medical corridor felt cooler by 10 degrees, light diffused to a soft gray, voices trimmed down to function. The field hospital smelled like antiseptic and clean plastic. Monitors blinked in steady, friendly rhythms. Nathan lay propped with a line in his arm and a patch of color back in his face, the strain eased off the corners of his mouth. He wasn't built for lying still. He looked like a man tolerating it because he'd been told it mattered. Grace took the rail with both hands and let the sight of him reset the day. Words weren't necessary. The shape of his breathing did the talking. Caroline came in with a tablet and a tone that turned worry into plan. Heat stress, dehydration, a cascade caught early, labs routine, overnight observation, no heroics. Rest would do what medicine started. Grace nodded and found the chair that seemed to be waiting for her. She didn't sit all the way back. She never did. Outside, the base went back to moving forward in the simple ways that keep people sane. A chow line opened on time. A supply truck parked where the driver's card said it should. Vaughn held a short formation for section leaders who'd been on the field. He didn't give a speech. He gave instructions. He told them what would be documented, who would be interviewed, what not to speculate about, and where to send anyone who tried to turn rumor into shape. He ended with a single sentence his people understood as a compliment: we stayed inside our training. Logan finished his statement and brought it to the table with both hands like an offering. The clerk stamped it and slid it into a folder without ceremony. That felt right. Logan stepped aside and finally let himself look back at the bleachers where he'd tucked two kids under a rail. He pictured how their helmets had knocked wood and smiled once, quick, the private kind you let out when nobody is grading you. Later, he would find those two and teach them how not to cross a muzzle line. Later, start small. It still counts. An investigator in plain clothes drifted through the medical wing to ask Grace soft questions that made hard edges clear. Where did you stand? How did you hold? What did you see that made you commit? She answered in the same even voice she used when paying bills. She didn't dress the moment up. She didn't clip it down. The pen moved, the tape clicked, the facts settled. When the woman closed her folder, she looked at Grace the way professionals look at other professionals, regardless of badges. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. Afternoon leaned into the windows in a warmer tone. The base had that quieter hum it gets after lunch, when the urgency of morning turns into the steadiness of keeping promises. Vaughn stepped into the doorway of Nathan's bay, cap under his arm, posture at ease but eyes still counting. He gave Grace the same nod he'd given her on the field, a little deeper now that the numbers had stopped changing. He said what leaders say when the big part is done and the important part begins, we're good for now. The words were simple. The weight behind them wasn't. Grace looked at Nathan and let the word now stretch long enough to hold a nap. She closed her eyes and drifted without falling, the way people rest in chairs next to machines that beep in honest meters. Somewhere down the hall, an orderly laughed at something that didn't matter. Somewhere outside, a forklift found reverse again and sang its little song to nobody who needed it. Life came back on in small switches. By late afternoon, the tow had dragged the ruined Humvee to a corner lot behind caution tape. EOD finished their notes and left with sealed bins that would teach classes later. MPs logged in a drawer's worth of evidence bags, as tidy as tax season. A work crew arrived with new bolts and a fresh gate arm. The barricade got its shape back. The base got its picture back. Grass clippings blew out of the gravel and settled in new places like nothing that happened cared where they landed. Grace walked out once to see the field reclaimed. The chalk had been set again. The lane lines had clean edges. The bleachers were empty and ordinary in a way that felt like a blessing. She stood where her feet had planted and looked at nothing in particular, the way you look at a room after company leaves. She didn't rehearse the moment. She didn't argue with it. She filed it under done and due to be felt later. As the sun dropped toward the tree lean, the warmth pulled a thin gold across the motor pool and the flag's shadow stretched long and narrow across the asphalt. Evening details clicked into their places. The base prepared to hand itself off to night shift, to lights that hum and guards who look taller under porch glow. Grace returned to the chair by Nathan's bed and let her fingers rest over his wrist, counting not beats but steadiness. He slept the good, heavy sleep of a body that had been hauled back from a slope and told to stay put. Paperwork would grow roots. Statements would be transcribed. A ceremony would be sketched on a calendar in pencil. The driver would be charged in language that sounded dry and absolute. Reporters would try to turn the day into something with angles that sold. The people who'd stood on the asphalt would know it as simpler and harder than any headline. A bad thing came fast, and a set of decent hands kept it from arriving. Grace didn't try to own that truth. She let it sit in the room like quiet furniture. When lights in the field hospital clicked down to a softer level and the corridor settled, Caroline stopped in the doorway with her tablet tucked under one arm, face released from duty by a fraction. She said the only thing that mattered at that hour, we're watching, he's fine. Grace nodded, the relief not loud, not dramatic, just deep. The day had started even, torn itself open, then stitched back together with a line you'd only see if you knew where to look. She watched Nathan breathe, listened to the steady machine sound that marked each rise and fall, and decided to stay put until dawn had the chance to be routine again. She kept her post beside the bed, and when the first thin gray pushed through the medical blinds, the world felt like it was trying on normal. The field hospital moved in a quieter meter, shoes soft on tile, carts rolling like low thunder far away. Nathan stirred, blinked through the fog, and found her hand already there. He didn't say much, he never needed to. The thank you lived in the way his fingers closed and stayed. A nurse checked vitals, noted the numbers with a nod that meant ordinary, and left the room with the kind of gentle efficiency that makes night feel less heavy. Outside, Fort Ridgefield picked its rhythm back up, not proud, not dramatic, just dependable. Reveille lifted and fell. The flag climbed the pole like it always did, unbothered by yesterday's tilt. The barricade stood straight again, bolts new and unapologetically bright. Chalk lines on the parade field were crisp enough to trick the eye into believing nothing had ever crossed them at the wrong speed. People came back to their posts. Schedules tapped their fingers. The base kept its promise to be itself. Vaughn stepped in mid-morning with a folder under his arm, posture easy, gaze still collecting. He didn't waste sentiment. He replaced it with clarity. The investigation would run its course. EOD had tagged the rig for lessons learned. MPs had booked Travis Hale under a stack of charges tall enough to blot out his name. There would be paperwork, always paperwork. And there would be a brief formation at sundown, because some things deserve to be said out loud in front of witnesses. He glanced at Nathan, read the color in his face, and tossed one dry line that held more care than it admitted: rest while the base is willing to let you. Grace took a slow walk alone before noon, out past the bleachers, along the fence line where the shadow of the flag traced a long, straight seam across the asphalt. She stopped where her feet had planted the day before and let the space speak in the quiet way places do after noise. The rake handle was gone. The cones were stacked. A new clipboard sat square on a table that had been hosed clean. Wind carried the smell of cut grass and oil. She let yesterday settle into the ground where it belonged, not vanished, not relived, absorbed. Logan found her by accident, or maybe on purpose, shoulders squared, helmet tucked under his arm like he'd earned the right to hold it that way. He didn't launch a speech. He stood for a second, searching for the exact shape of thanks that wouldn't float away, and landed on something true and plain. You gave us a chance. She nodded once, the way you return a salute without turning it into theater, and told him to keep his eyes where they count and his feet out of muzzle lines. He grinned, as if the instruction was a medal he could actually use, and jogged off to rejoin a life that suddenly felt wider. By late afternoon, the heat tucked behind thin clouds. The base gathered without being told how to feel. Section leaders formed ranks along the edge of the parade field. Families clipped in at the bleachers with strollers and quiet kids and that lean-forward attention ordinary people bring to uncommon days. The flag pulled a little in the breeze, stitching light through red and white. A bugle didn't play. This wasn't that kind of ceremony. It was a circle drawn around a lesson. Vaughn stepped to the small platform in front of the command building. His words were sparse, more frame than painting. A threat came. People did their jobs. One person without a job to do saw the gap and filled it because waiting would have broken the math. He didn't say hero. He didn't have to. The base knew how to hear what wasn't said when the speaker chose each syllable like it had weight. He called Grace forward by name, not rank. The sound of it crossing the asphalt made her spine feel too straight and not straight enough at the same time. She walked out through the seam between formations, aware of every footfall, the way bleacher boards sometimes remember you. Her visitor badge had been replaced with a simple lanyard that didn't try to rename her place here. Caroline stood near the front, arms folded, shoulders finally relaxed. Logan, 3 rows back, rose a hair taller without moving an inch. Nathan, released from the field hospital for an hour, stood at the edge with a staff for balance he insisted he didn't need, a color in his face that said stubborn and grateful in equal parts. Vaughn handed her a framed citation that wouldn't change the day but would keep the story from being told wrong later. His voice stayed level as he spoke the line he wanted recorded: decisive action prevented greater harm. He added one more sentence, softer, for the live audience instead of the record: hold the line you can reach. The applause came not as a roar but as a firm, even sound, like rain that knows what it's doing. Hands met, heads dipped, air moved. Grace didn't give a speech. She didn't list reasons. She let the moment pass through her like a current that didn't belong to one person. When she stepped down, Nathan caught her hand and squeezed once, exactly as long as the day deserved. Caroline bumped her shoulder in passing. Logan mouthed a quiet ma'am and looked like a kid who had learned something he could carry longer than a weekend. Dusk pushed blue across the field. Work lights blinked on near the motor pool with their soft electric hum. Orders for night shift swapped hands. The base folded into itself the way a town does when it trusts its own routines again. Reporters tried to stretch the story beyond its shape. Vaughn's PA gave them the names and the facts and nothing that could be bent into a movie trailer. The barricade stood there, mute and stubborn, as if to say, the line held because people held it. Back in the quiet of the quarters where visiting families were allowed, Grace sat with Nathan and let the day thin out. He told her the parts he remembered and the parts Caroline filled in. She told him about the lane, the sights, the choice she made in a slice of time too small to argue with. They didn't gild it. They didn't file it down. They set it between them like a tool, useful, heavy, not for show. Outside the window, a guard walked his route with that measured pace you can set a watch by. Somewhere a coffee pot hissed and clicked. A door down the hall closed with care. Night settled without demanding anything dramatic. Grace lay awake a little longer than she wanted, watching the red blink of a far-off tower through the slats. The thought that kept circling was simple and refused to turn into something fancy. Sometimes you don't get a second order, you get one clean window and everything you love inside it. You don't wait to be bigger than you are. You get small and exact and do the thing that keeps the next beat coming. Morning would come again with its practiced calls and its clipped responses. The field would host new drills under the same flag. Logan would teach two kids how to move without making someone else's shot harder. Caroline would sign off another shift with numbers that said steady. Vaughn would underline a sentence in a report and demand that the training block next month include what yesterday taught for free. Nathan would heal by inches the way strong people do when they stop pretending inches aren't the honest way back. Grace would drive out through the gate at some point, visitor lane, window down, badge returned with a smile for the guard whose name she'd learned. Ashwood Valley would be waiting with its slow roads and shade where afternoon likes to sit. She would carry the weight of a rifle that wasn't hers and a decision that very much was, not as a banner but as a reminder that ordinary hands are enough when they show up at the right time with the right steadiness. And Fort Ridgefield would keep breathing, steel bolted, chalk straight, people moving in lines that mean safety when they're followed and danger when they're not. The story would travel farther than the fence line, trimmed down to sentences and headlines and clips that missed the taste of dust and the feel of heat in the soles of your shoes. That was fine. The people who needed the whole of it already had it, in muscle and memory and in the quiet way a base looks the day after. The moral didn't need a banner either: hold what you can hold, help where you can help, and when the line in front of you goes soft, be the part that stiffens.